I'm protecting the environment!
In there.
Those of you who have been following this show for a long time probably remember way back before I started regularly posting things on YouTube, or learned how to use a hair tie, or a desk lamp for that matter, that I originally did a review for a game compilation disc put out by Capcom called the Capcom Classics Collection, a disc that held some of their best and admittedly worst arcade games back when they were still making those. And while I had quite a few issues with it, I did say that it was a solid buy for any fan of Capcom or anybody who enjoyed arcade games. Well, a few things have changed since then. I'm now a bit more rotund, I now have proper lighting, and I've finally figured out how to tie my hair back. That being said, however, one thing hasn't changed, and that's the fact that I'm still doing reviews. Whether that's a good or bad thing is a matter of opinion. That being said, though, I think it's time that we revisited that review and took a look at something that I had hinted at way back when in that early review, and that is taking a look at the Capcom Classics Collection sequel, Capcom Classics Collection Volume 2. So to recap, a few of the flaws that I found in the original were, 1, it had an overabundance of shooters, and while it did have quite a few other games, shooters made up over half of the collection, and I would have liked to see more genre variation. The second problem was, most of the games gave you unlimited continues, so there was no real incentive to try and get better or build up any sort of skill at this game, even though many of the games were designed to be quarter suckers and were insanely hard. Still, that was rather disappointing. Third, and probably the biggest pet peeve for me personally, was the fact that there were 3 different kinds of Street Fighter II on this disc, which was extraordinarily annoying for me, and I really would have liked to see a bit more variety in the fighters. Well, right from the start, I can tell you that while the amount of games isn't really that much different, there still is a pretty good list to choose from. The variety in the games is much, much better this time around. There actually is some decent genre representation here, and they actually give you some pretty good incentive to play these games, giving you bonuses like the ability to unlock tips, artwork, and even music from the games by performing certain tasks in them, such as reaching a certain point goal, or defeating a certain boss, or beating a certain level. Now, there are still a lot of shooters in this collection, but they are more varied and a bit more fun in my opinion, like 1941, which actually seems more like a standard shooter nowadays, to the very bizarre and kind of disturbing Eco Fighters game, which I have to admit was probably one of the funnier games just on its premise. You are literally fighting for the world, trying to destroy pollution by blowing stuff up. Yes, it is that cracktastic. But then you have games like Last Duel, which actually have some pretty interesting gameplay mechanics. You start off in a car, but every other stage you change into a jet, which is actually a pretty nice change-up and always keeps you guessing what's going to be in the next stage. Avengers notwithstanding, we're also given a huge amount of really fun and creative beat-em-ups and platformers to play, such as Black Tiger here, or the cult classic Captain Commando game, which by and large is probably the best game on the entire disc, just because it feels like it's such a complete game, and even as an arcade game, still feels kind of easy to get the hang of, unlike other games such as King of Dragons or Knights of the Round, which have that classic, really difficult beat-em-up kind of thing. I don't know what you'd call it, just that extreme difficulty. But then you have side-scrolling platformers like Magic Sword, and this cute little Cloudmaster game, which remind you that, well, platformers used to be in arcades too, but they were even more difficult. Heck, they even include the arcade version of the Strider game, which is by and large one of the most difficult and yet most rewarded games on this collection. Unfortunately, once again, fighters are kind of underrepresented in this game, but to my utter shock and amazement, the two that were included are not both Street Fighter II versions. The only version of Street Fighter II that was put onto this game was Street Fighter II Turbo, or the Super Street Fighter II Turbo. Yeah. But the other fighting game was, the original Street Fighter. You know, that extraordinarily stiff, almost unplayable version that was out on the Neo Geo. Yeah, that's one of my new criticisms of this collection is, even though there's a better variety of games, there is a much bigger ratio of games that are kinda crappy. Now don't get me wrong, I am very glad that they upped the variety in gameplay in this version, and I have nothing against difficult games, especially if they were designed to be difficult like most arcade games are, but there are a few games in this collection that just feel really cheap, like they were designed extraordinarily poorly, and could have been given a bit more beta testing, or just have gimmicks that don't work. Aside from that, though, there are some games that are actually pretty unique, too, like Block Block. While at first glance it may seem to be just another Arkanoid clone, like I thought it was, and how can you blame me, it does actually have one pretty interesting gimmick that makes it a much more interesting game. Your paddle actually is made out of crystal, and the more times the ball hits it, the more a counter in the corner will start to count down. If it reaches 0, the sides of your paddle will break off, making it smaller, and if it's at its smallest point and you run out of hit points, so to speak, then you lose a life, whether or not the ball fell. And then you have the 3 Wonders, which is actually a 3-in-1 arcade cabinet with 3 different games to choose from, which was actually pretty unique for the time. The first game, Midnight Wanderers, is a side-scrolling shooting game that reminds me quite a bit of if you threw Gunstar Heroes, Ghost and Goblins, and Metal Slug all together into a blender, you would probably come up with something similar to this. The second game, Chariot, is a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up that is pretty fun and has a pretty unique idea. Instead of your options following you around and shooting with you, they instead follow you like a giant tail, and if you press and hold down the special shot button, then they will fire a giant cataclysm of death forward in your honor. For great justice! Now the last inclusion of the 3 Wonders is a puzzle game, I guess you could call it that, called Don't Pull, which is, all things told, probably the weakest of these 3 games, if only because, not just because it lacks action like the last 2 games did, but overall it's a very underwhelming experience and does not really have anything memorable about it, even its look. So basically, the 3 Wonders is a game that comes with 2 testicles and a free vagina. But one of the most unique games on the entire game list, and probably one of my personal favorites just because I'm a nerd like that, is the game Quiz and Dragons, which is essentially a board game and question and answer game, kind of like Trivial Pursuit. You roll the dice, your character moves, and then you're asked a series of questions depending on what kind of space you land on, and if you get one wrong, you take a hit, but if you get one right, then your enemy takes a hit, and the idea is to try and answer a certain amount of questions correctly to move on to the next space. It's an extraordinarily long game, especially when you consider how short a majority of the other games on this collection are, and it's extraordinarily difficult, but I will give them credit in that none of the questions I came across seemed dated at all.
It's D&D, fighting with the legends of yore. It's D&D, never kissed a lady before. Nope, I did it.
Capcom must have also really liked this game too, because there's actually an alternate version of the game on this disc that is essentially the same game with 1 or 2 small changes, but the difference here is every single question in the Capcom Quiz version is about, what a shock, Capcom, whether it be about people who are working at Capcom, or about certain games or details in the creation of the games. It's actually really, really nice. The difference here, though, is that there are a few questions that have become dated. I came across a question once about the amount of games in a particular Mega Man series, which, since Capcom's quota about Mega Man seems to be about 5 games a month, well, you can guess how outdated the answer was. Now, even with all of these improvements, the variety in the games, the extras that they threw in, and the rather unique games that I had never even heard of before being present, one of my main complaints with the original volume is still true in Volume 2, and that's the fact that they give you unlimited continues. Now, many people pointed out that many of these games are extraordinarily difficult, and most people probably wouldn't see the end of the game if they didn't give them unlimited continues, to which I said, touché. Now, I still stand by my argument that giving a person unlimited continues does kind of cheapen the experience a bit. Even if you have the choice not to use continues, it still kind of feels like, well, there's no incentive to get better or try a new strategy if there's no penalty for dying except maybe losing your score. But here in Volume 2, it's made even worse with the inclusion of these extras. Now, most of the extras included in this game require you to beat a specific boss, beat a certain level, or just outright beat the game in order to unlock them. With unlimited continues, this becomes extraordinarily easy, and there's no challenge involved with it. Now, you could argue that the point total challenges, such as getting 100,000 points or so forth, would still be very hard to do, but this game even manages to undermine that. In many of the games, particularly the shooter games, later enemies and bosses are worth many more points than ones from earlier areas, so you don't really have to stay alive long enough, you just have to kill enough enemies in these later levels in order to reach the point goal. Even if you do end up dying, you'll still reach the checkpoint for that specific challenge, which really cheapens the idea of trying to get a high score. It's made even worse when some of the games don't even erase your score. Yes, in an ordinary arcade game, it is typical for a player to lose their score when they get a game over. The game just wipes it and has them start from zero. But in games like, say, Eco Fighter, or even in Quiz and Dragons, you don't lose your score if you lose a continue. So you can continue to fail and still unlock these extras, which to me really cheapens the idea of giving us these bonuses. Now, much like the first game, there really is not much point in me reviewing the graphics or the music for this game because it varies so widely from game to game. But I will say that pretty much all of the games look fantastic in this collection, and apart from a few hiccups here and there, the music is awesome as always. The fact that you can listen to it outside of the game is also a really big plus. So, with all things considered, how does this game stack up in comparison to the first collection? Well, they've definitely given us much more of a variety this time around, which I enjoyed, and the inclusion of the extras definitely gives us more of an incentive to play these games, but at the same time, it's a bit of a trade-off. You see, they did include a lot more games in this collection that are either just not fun to play, boring, or are so poorly designed that it doesn't even matter. And the fact that there are still unlimited continues still bugs me quite a bit. It's made even worse by the inclusion of the extras, as I've already pointed out, because there's no incentive to try for these extras. You can pretty much get them without any effort at all. This is definitely a collection that will still appeal to Capcom and hardcore fans, but to casual gamers like me who prefer console games to arcade games, well, it might also have something to do with the fact that I have no nostalgic connection to these games, but I will give them credit for giving us a nice variety that will please fans of the arcade genre. That being said, I do have to say that if you haven't played either of these collections yet, start with the first one, as that one may be a bit more mainstream and a better introduction to just what is being offered in these collections. And so there you have it. While I did enjoy this collection, I do have to say I was mildly disappointed with it, and I'd probably go back to the original Classics collection before I played this again if I found myself feeling bored. But with that being said, let it be known that I still have the utmost respect for Capcom, and this is definitely something that any fan of their work definitely has to have in their collection. And so that brings us to the end of this review. I hope you liked looking back at the past with me as I revisited my rather thin self in the past, and I do hope to see you again next week when we take a look at something a tad more interesting than a game compilation.
Burning fires, burning lives on the long distant roads, through the lost mountains endless, so far away from home.
Yes, we have saved the sea and dumped gallons of clean natural oil back into it.